Welcome, everybody. This is night 3 of the AIA Austin Women in Architecture, and we are presenting 2020 Hindsight, what we wish we would have known before graduating architecture school. And this is one of the many subcommittees for WiA Austin. In particular, this is called Call to Action, and we are focused on college students, particularly identifying and removing obstacles for people who are studying architecture. And this is one of our favorite programs. We have 4 nights of virtual programming where we kind of explore a topic that in hindsight, we wish we had known about. So let's get started. I want to thank all our sponsors. These are our WiA sponsors, and they keep us going all year round. These firms and individuals are amazing, and we're just so excited that they continue to sponsor this because it allows us to kind of come up with more creative programming like the kind of stuff we're doing today. And with that, let's jump in on our conversation. So just some housekeeping. I'm going to introduce us. I'm the moderator. My name is Janki DePalma. I'm the Director of Business Development at Kirksey Architecture. I'm also the chair for this whole call to action program. And I'm going to introduce our speakers, and then I'm going to stop sharing, and we're just going to have some fun chatting. I'm going to ask some questions. And for anyone in the audience, what I'd love you to do is anytime you have a question, just pop it in the chat. We'll get to it at the top of the hour. I wanted to kind of give some space for our speakers to talk. And then we'll open it up. We'll have questions. If you want to put the question in and then elaborate, I can go off mute and then you can elaborate on your question. We can just have like a really good discussion. So with that, let's meet the people who are talking today. So first I have Lindsay Abati. She is with Nelson Architecture. She is also on the AIA board with me. She is a commissioner, and she works on a variety of really interesting projects, especially some mixed use projects with Nelson, including 1111 West 6th Street, which I know is a really cool project. And I'm really excited to have her join because she brings this really interesting intersectional discussion. Heather Rule is with Pfluger Architecture, and she is working on all things education. I keep seeing pictures of her working on a variety of school projects. And Heather is rounding out, or just finished her year, I guess, with the chair for the Leadership Collective. So we have some people who are very active within AIA aside from their day jobs. And then Selma Sanchez works with me at Kirksey Architecture. She's going to be the incoming vice chair for LEO, Latinos in Architecture. And she is an Mexican native and an Austin local, which is always fun to find these unicorns who grew up here. And she will be talking about sort of her experience sort of, within the industry as well. So I'm going to stop sharing and we are going to get started. One thing in particular with this discussion is that this is really like our lived experience. Like all of us are talking only based on sort of like what we've gone through and what we've seen and what we've personally experienced. And I mean, ideally, I'd have like 100 people here because there's so many people who know what it feels like to be the only. But this is just like one of many talks. And we felt in particular, it was really important to talk about this because it's something that comes up a lot. And I think that's why you have groups like LEA and WiA and the LGBTQIA Alliance, because finding space is really important. And also talking and acknowledging about what it means to feel like the only in a room is something that we usually don't like give ourselves time to do. So with that, I kind of wanted to just dive in on this. So this topic really comes from the fact that when you are the only, which means like, let's say you're in a meeting, you find yourself looking around and you are like, in many cases, like the only woman or in the room, or like in my case, also the only, person of color in the room. It's like a very weird feeling. Like part of you feels very conspicuous, like that old Sesame Street song with like one of these things is not like the other. Like you feel like you stand out. But at the same time, you could also feel a little bit invisible because it feels like everyone else is connecting based on like whatever other reasons they have to connect and you're just sort of separate. So I wanted to dive in on this and sort of see like have everyone share kind of like how you feel like the only, like what experiences have you had and do you agree with this idea. So Lindsay, I want you to kick it off. Um, like, have you been the only? I assume you have because you signed up for our talk.
Yes. Well, thank you, Janki. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I've definitely been the only, and it's not just like a one time I was the only. It happens quite frequently. But I think that I wanted to start off by just talking about, how it can feel isolating at times, or how it felt at the beginning of my career compared to how it feels now. And I think that being in school, I was, one of several women, and I didn't feel necessarily like, oh, I'm a woman in architecture. And then I started my first job, and immediately I just felt a shift of, there's a lot less women here than in school, and it made me question why. And to me, that felt like very isolating and not like I knew how to approach it. And I think that you're going into it as somebody new. There have been people who've been there for a while, and so naturally they have more experience. They have the toolkit that maybe you haven't built up. And I think that when I started my career, I wish that I had the tools to find those people to grasp onto to make it feel less isolating. I think that throughout my career, I've definitely built that up to where I can see this as an opportunity to kind of focus on other individuals that might be going through that and hold their hand, welcome them in. And then, later in my career where I'm at now, I just, I have built up that confidence to know that just because I'm the only woman in the room often, that doesn't mean that my place there isn't, as important as everybody else's place, or, my voice can be loud and heard.
I love that. I love that perspective too about like when you first started versus, now having these years under your belt. Heather was nodding vigorously. So I know you have something to say. Tell me when you've been the only, you don't have to mirror Lindsay's discussion with the perspective, but I'm really curious, like, do you agree that it does feel both conspicuous and invisible or isolating?
Absolutely. And can you double check? Is my mic working?
It is. There's a teeny bit of feedback, but it's good. It's okay.
Okay. And I'll try to fix it. And then in the next one, I switched over to the computer. Yeah, I think that there's always only moments, right? I was nodding vigorously because I was thinking I feel like I live in that world right now. I manage projects. Like right now I'm managing a large high school project, and we're headed into construction administration. So if there's an area where there's more men than even in our firms, it's when you go out on site.
Mm-hmm.
You go out on site, and I get so excited when I see a woman on site. And I can probably count. I've been working for more than a couple of years now, and I can probably still count on two hands the number of times I've seen a woman on a site. And but when I sit at the table, I am also very fortunate right now to be in a position where I sit at the table. The assistant superintendent of operations of the district is a male. His two project managers are males. On the contractor side, all the superintendents, project managers, directors, they're all guys, but they treat me with respect. I've never once with that team felt isolated. But I notice it, right? I go into that job site trailer, and I'm like, man, I'm the only woman sitting here often. But it's nice to be treated with respect. I've definitely they listen, they ask for my opinion, which is very contrary to a lot of the years before. I've got more stories of the opposite scenarios. But I wanted to start with that positive note because it's don't lose hope. And maybe even 3 years ago when I started working with a lot of this same team, I may have not actually felt the same. I can't say that I remember that part. But over time, I earned the respect that they now give me.
I
So
love that.
if you are feeling like the only one in the room, don't let that suppress yourself. You know, I'd say be strong enough to just keep on showing up, and with time, good people will respect you.
That's great. All right, Selma, I want to hear your story. Have you, felt like that where you feel like you're the only sometimes?
Yeah, certainly. Going back to the construction site, sometimes um, it feels like I'm a representation of my community as a woman, as a person of color. And if I happen to see a construction worker or something, like a foreman, and he's also Hispanic, I acknowledge him and I say hi to him in Spanish. And, like, how's your day going? Just try to make the environment more like own it instead of try to diminish myself and my abilities. And because we're all valid, we're all here for a reason. And I think I'm at a point in my career where I'm not super straight out of school, but I'm not super experienced either to run a whole project out myself. So I sometimes get treated, a little, um, I don't know, like with a little bit less respect, I guess, if we can call it that for lack of a better word. But they definitely do are willing to listen and to be understanding of the questions that I ask. So I think, we don't know what we don't know, and up until we get to being Heather, we can all just learn from our experiences and take the positive and the negative and just grow from every single moment that we have.
Very cool. You bring up this really, really interesting point, which I think is part of like that sort of the only and like the conspicuousness is sort of becoming this de facto ambassador to whatever identity you that's part of you, either like placed on you or that you have, like not all identities are like physically visible, it could be like other things like your orientation or other things that have, it's just kind of like a extra question. Have you ever felt like all of a sudden you can't just be you? Like I'll state my thing. Like sometimes when I go to even if I go to a restaurant, I suddenly feel like I'm the ambassador for like all Indian people. So how I tip is now reflective. Like I can't just be like a cheapie as a regular person. Like now I've like somehow have like this ambassadorship. So it's like everything I do now is like a representation, even if I didn't sign up for it. I'm curious, like, do you guys ever feel like, especially in spaces where there are not a lot of women or other identities, there's a lot of intersectionality with us, where all of a sudden you're like, oh, like now I'm going to be like the rep for this group. Like, has that happened to anybody else? Heather, you were shaking your head. Like, do you sometimes feel like you're now representing all womankind?
Oh, all the time. I feel like there's extra pressure. And I have to ask this. I had the good privilege of working with Selma when she first graduated. So, Selma, you're well on your way to the big projects and being right there. But yes, Janki, you're sharing that. And I'm thinking of a time. I used to live in North Carolina, and the amount of times you walk on site and you get catcalled is uh, is it happens, right? And I frequently get I also happen to have grown up in South America, so I'm fluent in Spanish. So some of what you were sharing about, being able to talk to somebody in a language and have those conversations. There's many positive stories with that. But I learned at one point to turn around and just greet them in Spanish. Or that only works when it's in English or Spanish in my world, right? But just with that, it's enough to make them, you can just see the expression on a face that they've realized they've crossed the line. I never felt the need to correct them. I didn't, and just their reactions, right?
Yeah,
That you
yeah,
definitely stand out.
yeah, definitely. Lindsay, have you felt this like ambassadorship?
Yeah, I often do, and I feel like a responsibility as a role model to other women, to like always be on point and always perform. And then also as somebody who not necessarily presents as a lesbian, but as somebody who is in the queer community, and that it's not visible when I go into a meeting, but things always come up like, what does your husband do? When I don't have a husband, you know, just like things like that. And then I feel like, well, I don't know, you know, how, or like, am I representing the whole queer community because it's so diverse? But what does that mean professionally? And a lot of times there are, you know, boundaries that people don't know that they're crossing, or blind spots that people have that are not meant to be offensive or ignorant, but can be. So yeah, I definitely have felt the ambassadorship and not wanting to let any of my communities down. So there's, you know, pressure, but also a privilege to be a representative of both of those communities.
Yes, but I think your point though about like, you know, like wanting to stay sharp because you might have that extra, you know, like, you know, representation element sometimes prevents, you know, it's like an extra, it's like an app running in the background that's kind of draining you. Like you're still kind of, so it could also prevent you from just like, you know, spitballing and coming up with like random ideas because you're like, I don't want to be the one who like spitballs and then says something
Right.
absolutely like you will definitely be filtering yourself more because you're kind of like oh so this brings up this concept of like what does belonging mean, because that's really what we're talking about ultimately, right? When you feel like you're the only, it's kind of like I don't belong with this group because everyone else is like I'm very different. So I want to hear from, you know, like people human beings are social creatures, right? Like we're pack animals, get safety in being together, right? In, you know, in the tribe. So what does belonging look like now? You know, we don't necessarily have the same tribe mentality of like hunter gatherers. We're in, you know, the work world. So I'm curious, like, what are your thoughts of like, can you help paint a picture of what it either means to belong, or even the opposite of the times where you felt like, this is not my jam. Let's see, who am I gonna pick? I'll pick Heather, and then I'll have Selma go after that.
But, you know, what does belonging mean? I think belonging means something different to all of us. To me, belonging means to be asked for my opinion, to be then for my opinion to be listened to. To me, agency is a huge thing, and agency is really a term that comes from sociology, and it means, do we have the ability? Do you have the, if you have agency, you have the ability to make and implement a decision. So for me, that's belonging. Am I able to not just make a decision, but get it implemented? That doesn't mean every time, right? We work on projects where there's lots of opinions, there's a lot we can learn. So it's finding the balance between those two. But for me, belonging means that I have agency.
That's interesting. I mean, do you find that was that part of your mindset even when you were like earlier in your career where maybe you didn't have like the actual ability just based on your role to make any decisions, but still having the agency to decide, you know, what you're doing or how you show up and things like that?
That's a great question. I definitely did not feel like I had it. You know, as my role has changed and I've switched from being part of a project team to being more responsible. So agency, I felt like I've had more I feel like I've had more agency since I've gotten more responsibility. But I also want to make sure that I give that agency to the people that are on my projects, right? But with agency also comes large responsibility from me. And I'm a very, as you can probably already all tell, I'm a very intense, outwardly spoken. But if I give you agency, I want you to take it, you know, and not everybody's comfortable with that. So it also comes to mentorship and making sure that I'm providing a structure on my teams where people feel that they've got that ability to make a decision or share their opinions.
That's interesting because there's this element of like sort of this empathy because you know what it feels like not to belong, to then like kind of be extra cognizant of that in like your other team members to sort of, and since you're looking at agency in that way, it's sort of like you're really aware of that versus maybe somebody who hasn't felt like, who's always felt like they belong, like every door is open to them, right? So Selma, what is like earlier in your younger in your career, I guess, how would you define agency? Would you kind of follow Heather's description? I'm sorry,
Yeah,
how would you describe belonging? Like, is it
so
Heather's, or do you have something different?
going hand in hand with what Heather just mentioned, I've been at Kirksey, it's about to be a year now, and I felt like pretty early on, I felt a sense of belonging. I think one factor in which I looked at Kirksey being the place for me was seeing women in leadership. Our student director here is a female, and there's many people, like just going through our intranet, you could see people stay here for a very long time, and there's females in leadership positions, and that was like, you know what, like I could be one of them one day, later down the road. And more closely, my PM that I'm working on right now with is also female, and I feel like we always I always feel like she's like an older sister type of, like that type of vibe. And I think Heather was my mentor at my first job, and I did tell her, like, it feels like you're my older sister, like I can ask you the dumb questions without feeling like I'm, I don't know, like judged because you've been in my shoes. And like we're all learning, and we've all dealt with the same details, sooner or later. And I think just seeing and having those windows of opportunities for mentorship are very, very crucial to feeling like you belong. And, like maybe if something happens, like, hey, could I actually sit down with you and chat a little bit? Like this, we just had a meeting, and, like the client didn't even acknowledge that I was in the room, like, um, could I have done more for the next meeting? Should I introduce myself first? Or, instead of waiting for something to happen, should I be the seeker, and just having that person that's in your corner, it makes a ton of a difference.
Definitely. And you're bringing up this really interesting point. You kind of touched on it. It has to do with the sort of like the entire pipeline. And we talk about this in a variety of things. I know like NOMA talks about this. WiA has done their Missing 32 study, which like sort of like the fallacy that I think a lot of, places have when it comes to the lack of diversity. It's just like, oh, we don't have enough people starting out, and therefore that's why everybody looks the same, like it's like a funnel, right? But actually, the studies have shown that like there are a lot of people coming in. It's sort of like how are they fitting into the organization, like as entry level, and then that first rung to manager, who gets promoted, who gets to stretch assignment, who gets sponsored versus just mentored. These are all like, these are the leaky parts that are, and that a lot has to do with belonging. Because like Brene Brown has this really good quote in her book, and it talks that like, like the difference between like belonging and fitting in. Like fitting in is where you sort of like shapeshift to be like everything around you, and belonging is where you could like really be your full self, and everyone's like, this is great, like, like that. So I'm curious, like, because you mentioned, Selma, like looking at the Kirksey hierarchy and going like, okay, there's obviously like the pipeline, there's a lot of diversity. Our firm is actually really diverse in a variety of ways. So Lindsay, like you have a senior role in your firm, like, and you've taken on like, you were, this commissioner role in AIA, which was all about like trying to like pull these groups together. What are your thoughts on sort of that pipeline excuse? Like, we just need more ladies to, finish architecture school kind of thing like that.
Yeah, I mean, definitely so many thoughts on this.
We got time.
And I think that, Janki, you mentioned sponsorship and mentorship, and I think those are two very important things. Obviously, like sponsorship is what you really want. And in my career, I've been at places that pipeline, it wasn't there. Like I wasn't going to get there. It was finding a place where I had, to Selma's point, the person to ask the dumb questions to be able to grow, to feel like, to Heather's point, I was given agency, like all of those things coming together in one, place to get me to where I'm at. And then as somebody who's on a leadership team, looking for those opportunities for the people that I work with, and just in the community in general, because I think that we tend to like look at women and other minorities, but somebody that we don't necessarily is at the top of the list are quiet people. And I think that we have so many really talented, quiet people that are afraid to use their voice in a meeting. So I think that there's some importance in being able to identify those individuals and make sure that what they have to say gets heard. And really, as new people are joining a firm, give them a clear path. Like, this is what onboarding is going to look like for you, and this is going to be your peer mentor, and then this is going to be, your project team, and like give them the opportunity to belong and give them the opportunity for growth. Yeah. So I think that, when Selma and Heather were talking, the kind of sparks were flying when they were talking about agency
and I think you're right. I mean, so much like the decisions about your career are made when you are not in the room. They're made by other people.
Right.
And so it's like, how do you get those people to see what your potential is, advocate for you? And it's such a natural human instinct. Like, the bias tends to get very vilified, but it's just kind of like, it's more like this affinity. It's like, this person kind of reminds me of me, and so, which is fine until you're the person who doesn't remind you of anybody. Like, like I remember going to an event once where it was like a bunch of GCs, and I was with another business development person, and she was like, "Oh, don't worry. Like, these guys are really sweet. They look at me like I'm their daughter and they want to help. I don't look like their daughter." And I remember thinking like, oh goodness, like, and it's not like they were bad people or anything. It's just like so to be able, like, that's where I feel like when you have diversity, you have the ability to call out like, okay, like this introversion bias that you're talking about. It's just like, all right, let's, just because this person's not like taking up so much space doesn't mean they're not an amazing leader, or other elements like that, I think is really, really important. Um, so you actually wrote down, when you guys were talking, allyship. So it's like how, it's it's great when you have like top leaders who are, represent, like, so you're not the only, but until that happens, I mean, we all need allyship. We are allies in various ways. So I'm curious, like, if you could share some stories where, you had somebody who, like kind of like held the door open for you and, served as either a sponsor, a mentor. It could be something like a tiny story where, like I told you about this question, but I'll give you an example so you can think of something yourself. Like, sometimes it's just that person. I was at a meeting the other day, and it was kind of one of these, like, everyone's like barking questions and stuff. And I kept trying to ask a question, and usually I'm not interrupted because I have such a loud voice, but someone kept like talking over me. And then the guy who was leading it, when it kind of calmed down, he goes, "You had a question, like, what was it?" Like, he didn't let it pass that, like, I was talked over. And that was like a very small, subtle example of, I feel like, allyship, where he wasn't just like, okay, it's going to be a free for all. This gal didn't get her question and we got to move on to the next slide. So it doesn't have to be big elements, but it could be small, subtle elements. Do you have stories like that where you feel like someone's, paying attention to you, so you're being seen? I'm gonna look at my Brady Bunch screen. Lindsay, I'll go with you this time. I always pick on Heather first, so I'll give her a break.
Yeah, I think I've had like the same thing happen to me, and I've always really appreciate it. And I try to do that for other people as well. But another, kind of situation where, I brought up something and then somebody else brought up the same thing and it was received differently. And I had somebody say, "Hey, oh yeah, like what Lindsay said." And I was like, "Thanks." Like that was cool. But also like I think and I knew this question was coming about allyship, and I think that a lot of the work that WiA does is really great. And I think that when I see men go to WiA events, I think that that's the best. Like I think that that's really great that they're showing up and like saying, what is this about, and like what are these women talking about. And so I think that that's another example that we see of allyship that is really incredible.
That's very, very interesting. And there's a couple follow-ups, but I want to hear everyone's allyship story. Actually, I haven't asked you a question yet, Selma. So have you experienced this in big or small ways, allyship?
I feel like I'm also a quiet person. So on top of all the other things that I have on my plate, it's like I'm also quiet. It's like, oh, but I know at some points, when it's like our internal structural meeting or something, I don't know. And I'm like, you know what? This is my time to speak up because it's just us. It's the project team, the consultants, us. And I'm like, okay, well, what happens if we leave like over here? I don't know. It's and then just knowing that my PM can back me up and be like, oh yeah, that's actually a good question, Selma, because I didn't even notice that this beam was in the middle of the skylight. Something that was like, hey, Selma, shout out to Selma because she noticed that while we were doing details. And just being recognized for like the smallest things that we do. I'm like, oh yay. Now people know, who I am, what I do, and then I'm not that I'm somewhat of an integral part to this product team. And besides that, I think I've been very fortunate to work on a very cool project here at Kirksey. And, even some of my coworkers are like, I wish I was on your project. And, just knowing that we have those opportunities to speak up and be like, hey, actually, if we get another project like that, so and so would like to be part of this, just knowing that we have opportunities to grow and just kind of shape our careers, and just knowing that there's a platform to do that, especially at the company that we're at, Janki, I'm pretty sure you've seen it, we have staff meetings and it's very fluid. We're all friends here. And I think that's step one in being allies, just being able to trust one another in and out of work, just
Yeah, and I think this is not a Kirksey commercial. It just
no,
happens
no.
to be like we both really like it. But I feel like these are similar stories that other places have, where especially for Lindsay and Heather as more senior leaders, where you start making those decisions of like who gets that stretch assignment, like who's ready for this, and start talking about that. But Heather, I know you must have these stories of allyship. Like I think that's because what's so difficult is like I think a lot of times, especially like men, might feel like I don't want to center myself. Should I butt in? Making it worse by saying something. Like, what are your examples, either big or small?
Yeah, I think there's two things that come to mind, and they're very different. But one, I have an outgoing personality, and I tend to not have a fear to speak. So I try to be the voice in the room that points out moments that are anti-Jedi, right? When I see equity or justice not happening, um, I intentionally use my leadership position to call it out. It doesn't mean, making a big deal out of it. Sometimes we don't know. We just need to be reminded. Um, and so I use my position as that. And then the other way I use allyship is in recruiting. I'm part of our recruiting team. So making sure that we're recruiting diversely, whether it's, whether that's gender, race, or nationality, making sure that we're being very supportive of, international students and people that want to migrate here, and making sure that they're getting the legal support, uh, to make sure that they can stay, and intentionally hiring people that are different than anybody we currently have in the firm.
That's incredible, because I think there's so many areas where it could be easy to not hide behind, but get caught up in like, what is a cultural fit? And then that crosses so many of these elements like age or, extroversion or any of these things where you're like, like we're all like chatty people. So this person's really quiet. I don't know if they're going to fit in. It's like, well, hold on a second. Like that could be where you're at least calling it out and going, or don't write off somebody because they might need sponsorship. Like they're an international candidate, and
Yeah.
what could we do? What are the things we could do to support that candidate instead of just saying that's not something we do?
Yeah. Or in trying to bring those two together, right? Because often if we come from diverse backgrounds, maybe the way we're joking about something or approaching a moment might be different just based on our culture. So trying to turn that, at least internally in the office, into a conversation of
Yeah.
why something might be different.
Yes. Yeah. Actually, we had this conversation about when English is not your first language and you're a designer, and like just the cognitive like gymnastics that go on, especially for you, because you're bilingual, like what that means. I think it's a very interesting one. One of the things though, this is kind of an added question, but as we're talking about allyship, uh, a lot of us are involved in these sort of our chapter's version of like employee resource groups, right? Like there's WiA, LEA, NOMA, which is a separate group, but we're very active with them, the Alliance. I, what would you say to someone who goes, I don't understand why we need these special groups. You don't see men in architecture as a group, right? Which, not to name names, when I was at another place, I remember someone said, like, I don't understand why you have women in engineering because you don't have men in engineering. And I just like nearly like blew my top off trying to explain why. But I'm curious from your point of view, why do you think these groups add value, not just for the people who are part of that group, but for other people who are supporters? Kind of like what you were saying, Lindsay, about like when a man joins WiA, it's a welcomed thing. Like, why do you think we have these groups, and why are they so valuable? Um, this is a toss up. So I didn't give this question in advance. So Heather, I mean, you've talked a lot about this with the leadership collective and stuff. Why do you think these groups are important?
You have to give places for people to have a voice. It's how we change the pipeline. It's how we changed once people are in the pipeline. We have a responsibility to amplify those who are not automatically amplified by being the majority.
That was perfect. I love it. Selma, you're the incoming LEA chair. I won't make you say why this is, if you want to say why, or just like why you find LEA to be a safe space for you. Like, why are you, what value do you find from it?
Like Heather said, it's a space that I feel like everywhere I turn now, everyone either looks like me, relates to me culturally or physically, and we have things that we can bond over besides just the collaborative architectural things that we deal with anybody else. And just talking through, like, hey, I had this difficult situation, or like, hey, like, what would you do? Just having that camaraderie and just knowing that this is my people. And I don't know, like, I look forward to, like meeting new people that show up at the LEA meetings once a month. And I try so hard to tell them, like, you know what, like, we are trying to make this a safe space for you, me, and everyone that's to come. We're trying to, just like bulldoze over any thoughts negative or that anybody would just go into architecture and be like, I don't think this is a place for me. There's too many men, there's, whatever. there's a lot of things that go into just deciding to pursue architecture and any other related, STEM industry, if we're being honest. But so yeah, just being like, you know what, I'll see you at the host tour next week. Hey, do you have tickets? Be like, let's get some, just having that camaraderie and just knowing that there's somebody that looks like you or has the same concept and principles that you also are trying to like put into the world out there. You get what you put in. You attract a positive, and I don't know. I feel like it's just a Leah family. Like as with a bunch of other AIA organizations and NOMA as well. It just kind of brightens your day when you see them anywhere out in the public. You're like, hey, there's my Noah person, there's my Leah person. And I don't know, it's just a sense of belonging too, and just knowing that it doesn't only exist in our 9 to 5, but also within our bigger community in Austin and national for that point.
Very true. So I wanted to bring this other point we've kind of touched on a little bit and has to do with intersectionalism. So it's, especially when you maybe have like two elements that are part of your identity that might not be part of the mainstream. And I wanted to ask Lindsay in particular, because this has come up a lot with the Alliance, because some of our identities are like front and center. Like you already, like you see what color skin I am, and you could pretty much tell like she looks like what's classified as a woman, right? Like, like my identities in this way are very pronounced, but there's other identities that aren't, right? But you brought up, your situation, and I'm curious, like, there's like if you don't mind me, it's like, are there elements that sometimes feels like, like I don't know if I want to expose this. Like,
Oh,
do I
yeah.
want to tell everyone my like personal story, or do I just want to like scoot on by as an architect and not and let them make their assumptions? And like, where does intersectionality come in for you?
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. And it's something I've been navigating in architecture, since the early aughts. And I think in my first job, I, presented a little bit more queer than maybe I look now, but not, really. And it took me a really long time in that job to come out, but wherever you're working, you want to feel comfortable. So I think that after that first job, I kind of developed my kind of, how am I going to approach this going forward? And I decided that I needed to come out during the interview process every time so that I knew that I would feel, and that's like my personal decision, but, finding a small way to come out so that I could kind of gauge the reaction, make sure I'm going to be comfortable and welcomed at the firm. And so I would say something like, oh, this is great, but I just need to discuss it with my wife. Or I'm really interested in the Alliance here in Austin. Do you have anybody in your firm who participates, or something like that? So that's how I've approached it in terms of like my immediate firm. And I've been at Nelson for quite some time and very comfortable here, but then it's, beyond the firm and in the
Like
community of
clients, like what do you do?
architecture.
Is it like you're at an OAC meeting? When do you bring this up? I mean,
Clients, contractors, everything, I'll be like, oh, I've got to, run and pick up my kids. They see that I'm married, and they're like, oh, what does your husband do? Like, the questions that you probably shouldn't ask anyway. But, I've, depending on how comfortable I am, I'll be like, well, my wife actually, or if I'm not comfortable, I kind of just say that's okay. Like, I don't need to come out every day to everyone that I know, and I'll kind of just skirt around the question. But it is, a challenge, because you do feel like you never know, not that I'm very out and proud, and but I think that sometimes it can be a little bit trickier questions to navigate. And that's why the Alliance is so great, to have that resource to be able to connect with people in our community and understand like maybe some strategies that they have for when the contractor, not to like single out contractors, but when they might say something inappropriate or you might feel a little bit uncomfortable. So
yes, and I think, it also brings up this really interesting concept of like your identity versus how you present, because like Heather, your background, having lived in like Spanish speaking countries, is, like might not be like immediately presentable, right? Like when they meet you, kind of like when you said you walk in, you see the GC or like the like some trade partner, and you might talk to them in Spanish. And that's still part of your identity, even if you aren't like ethnically, like, I don't know where the division line is, but like you're ethnically Latina, but it's just like, that's a huge part of your identity and upbringing. Do you ever find stuff like that where all of a sudden people might make some assumptions of who you are and what your background is that, you either like clarify or let pass or
I do a mix of it, but I feel like I have a lot of imposter syndrome when it comes to the Latina identity, right? Because I am white, I grew up very privileged, so I definitely I can't relate to the struggles, but I feel Latina. I always tell people my heart was born in Latin America. But I don't have those judgments put on me because of my color. So I try to be an ally, right? That's where I try to be an ally and amplify the voices and um, make sure that I help Latins, that I help Hispanics, and their voices get amplified. But I was thinking of something which I'm gonna tie together. Lindsay, when you were talking, I had somebody say something to me a long time ago that stuck with me, and I refer to my partner as partner because and he's a guy from Latin America. Because it completely removes, I think that's one of the things that we can do as allies, right? Make the world more of an equal playing ground. It doesn't matter what gender my partner is or how they identify. They're part of my support system, and it shouldn't be something that we all judge others in. It certainly has led to some fun opportunities when people ask or make assumptions. You use the term partner, and it tends to lead to a lot of people making assumptions. But to me, that's just an opportunity to have a conversation.
This is a really interesting side thing because we were having this discussion and with like a friend of mine about putting your pronouns, and like they put it in their signature line. And I was asking her, and it's weird because I actually put my pronouns in, they're not showing up. So I have to like fix that. But I had asked her like, wow, that was like a big corporation. Like this is, and most places I've been regulate that signature line. Like you can't put, and they're very specific. And I asked about that, and she said, well, it sort of like normalizes things. So instead of like having the one person who has like specific pronouns that need to be used, that they have to, it becomes a thing. It just makes it like, okay, everyone has pronouns. And similarly, it sounds like your concept is like partner can just mean like who I'm sharing my life with. And it doesn't mean like man, woman, legally married, long time, whatever. It's just if everyone kind of used it, it didn't like you don't have to then make your thing specific and break it down. And it kind of sounds like what you're doing is
Yeah.
kind of like the same way, like using your privilege to just say, I'm going to say partner. And if they ask or make assumptions, like I'm going to call them on that assumption without making like a federal case out of it. But, like
Sometimes the federal case is okay.
like, why is it? But I think that's an interesting thing to do. Like, how can we all kind of start using these like small inclusive bits of language where, we just pay attention, like, you know, like it. And I think it's interesting when Lindsay talks a lot about how she presents because so I grew up in San Francisco. And so I had a lot of friends who like I didn't know what their orientation was. They didn't know what their orientation was. And so I didn't really grow up with necessarily like assuming there was a certain affect that led to an orientation. And I have this is a topic that I talk with the kids a lot about where I'm like, these are completely different things. Like who you are attracted to doesn't correlate to like how you present and what you wear, or like what the cadence of your voice is. And I feel like, and it can be, but it's not like correlated. And I think it's really interesting when you talked about that, about like, you know, do people have assumptions of what they think someone in the queer community is? And are you fitting that box? And if you're not, like, what does that mean? How do you still like bring your full self? So this kind of ties into everyone's favorite discussion, which is microaggressions, right? It's like the small things, like, what does your husband do, right? And you're just like, it's not a big deal until you've been asked it like 10 times a day. And then it becomes a deal, right? You're just like, why can't I just say I'm going to my partner and it, right? So I want to talk about that a little, because it's a thing that I feel, a lot of times when we talk about systems, you think about these like there's that iceberg, of like issues, right? And the top will be something like a slur, right? And then there's all this stuff in the bottom of the iceberg, which are like the microaggressions, where, like for me, where someone just assumes I'm the secretary, and I'm just like, no, I'm not the secretary. I'm not no offense to secretaries or receptionists, but I'm not that person in this role just because you see me here as like the only person of color, or anything else like that, where you're just like, or I get something about my name and I'm kind of like, it's not a big deal until it's like everyone's talking about it. And then you're just like, just say all the letters. It's not that hard. Ask me how to say it. You don't need to comment on like how weird it is. I get it. So I want to hear from you guys. Like, have you experienced microaggressions? How, especially like in the professional workplace, because it's sometimes hard to get like feisty, right? On that. So I'm going to pick on Selma because I did ask you guys this question in advance. So you had time to think about it. So have you had that professionally, or anything where all of a sudden, you're just like, seriously, like, why is this happening?
I think a lot of the times, really, I'm very oblivious to a lot of things. I don't let things really like affect me. But the thing that I've noticed, is food. Because like sometimes we're like, someone, where do you like to go out to have food, Mexican food? And like, I don't usually go out to get Mexican food, but like the fact that you asked me so pointed, like you're like, what are your favorite tacos? Or like, where do you get your XYZ from? I'm like, you know, or like the fact that I ask for salsa whenever we go out to have lunch. It's like, why do you put so much spice on your food? Like, because I like it. I don't know. It's just like little things like that. It's like, okay, I have to be nice. I'm not gonna, cause a scene, but I'm also gonna, just be like, just take a little second to just think about what you just asked me.
I was reading this thing that talked about how the term like an authentic whatever restaurant has like this sort of like colonial, like this idea that like it's really authentic, like the real people of that culture eat there, and it's sort of like fetishized, and in a way that's kind of what you're alluding to, is like you as a Latina, like the legitimate places to eat, and you're like, well, I like this, or I make it at home. Like just because I like it, I'm not like the authority on Indian food. I just happen to like this place, and stuff. So it's an interesting one. And especially like, I, like what you mentioned about the thing about the spiciness. Like I hear you. I'll get that too, where someone's like, yeah, but that's interesting. You're kind of like, sometimes you don't want to have to
Yeah.
explain that. Like you might not ask why someone puts so much salt on their food, or right. Like it's just like, why is that called out?
Mhm.
What about you, Heather? Do you get like any kind of things where, or maybe early on in your career?
Yeah, I get asked all the time how I like spicy food because I grew up in South America. I'm like, Ecuadorians don't eat spicy food. Like, also, not all of Latin America is the same.
What? You're kidding me, right? They're not all exactly the
Yeah,
same.
yeah. Although living in Texas, my spice tolerance for just will know my spice tolerance has increased. But no, I think as a female in the industry, it's the gender role, right? You're at a meeting. I'm in a world right now where I am in a leadership position. For some reason, I'm still always the one cleaning the room. at the end of a meeting, right? We end a meeting, people leave, it's a charrette. People leave trace paper everywhere, dirty plates from the morning scones or muffins. And yet I said, I still find myself cleaning the room, just being the one that even thinks to clean the room. So I guess on some level, I do the microaggression even to myself. I find myself often being the one that treats myself that way, being the one that takes the notes. I'm in the secretary position, even though I'm often running the meeting and taking the notes at the same time. So I think I'm on so many levels. I'm like, give me advice. How do I stop? How do I
Well,
stop
I think
falling into my own microaggressions?
you're bringing up this really interesting concept, because there is, I mean, part of like when you're the only is this feeling like there's this should, right? Like as a woman, should I, like, I can't leave this messy thing for somebody. And I think that's an interesting thing to note and say, like, I don't know what the situation is, but it could, like, the note taking be rotated and be like, you know what, like, my notes, it's like I need to rotate this out. Like, Bob, you're taking notes today. You're good with that, right? Like, and or even just like as it's leaving, be like, oh, hey guys, like, you know what? Last time this place was a disaster when we left. Let's all just like, like, because you're noticing it, but I think it's very, very common to carry that mental load and sort of like the de facto, like, oh yeah, the woman's like, you're gonna take notes, but when you're running the meeting, like you can't take notes. You're leading the meeting. So it's like a guy, you know, yeah, it's like your chromosomes don't like prevent you from taking notes, right? So I think it's something to think about. What about you, Lindsay?
I mean, I think 100% what Heather was saying. I am the planner, the note taker, the picker upper, like the old coffee cups around the office and the dishes in the sink, like 100%. So I feel that. But like, I think so many thoughts on microaggressions in general, but one thing that I found being on the leadership team is that we'll talk about like an event that we have coming up and who we should have plan it. And they'll throw out the names of all the women in the office. And I'm like, okay, guys, like, let's try to ask some of the men in our office to plan one of the events. Like, we don't want to look at our women employees as like the party planners. Like, it is fun and everybody, if somebody wants to do it, they should do it, but we shouldn't just say like, okay, this person looks like they know how to throw a party. So that's something that I've seen. I think that some microaggressions can definitely be a little bit more serious because they just in general promote inequality. And I've had a lot of moments in my career where, I worked up to it, but I have become confrontational with individuals in, the most professional way. Just like, hey, what did you mean by that? Can we sit down? Can we talk about it? Because if I don't address those things, like, what does it say about me and the position that I'm in? So I think that, we have to be able to really identify when it's serious. And I think that, just as a side note, when Heather was mentioning taking notes, sometimes I feel like I'm the only person in the room that brings their notebook. And I was taking notes in a meeting the other day, and I had a gentleman say like, oh, I've lost Lindsay's attention. And it was, a Zoom meeting and I'm taking notes. I'm the only one. And I was like, that's a microaggression. It's not, why did he single me out and say, I've lost Lindsay's attention? My attention is there. It's on the notebook. And anyway, I think that those types of things can be problematic. And that's a situation that, afterwards I'm like, hey, what did you mean by that? Like, it's not very professional. So.
Yes. And I think sometimes, like, I find even just like playing dumb will be like what, you know, because usually sometimes like a microaggression will be sort of like playing on like a pun or a double entendre, like something that like you should get the joke. So sometimes it's just like, what do you mean by that? I don't know.
Yeah.
And then they're just like, and then it's like as they try to unpack that, it kind of like falls apart. Um, but I think, you know, when you mentioned like the like as now a leader calling out like who does the office work is a really valuable one. Like we do a lot of internal sort of team culture. We have this culture committee, and it traditionally like it's open to anybody, but traditionally a lot of women lead it. And we started rotating it out and just picking like two people who are going to do it this month. And usually it's like two people who kind of look like friends in the office, or like you two, and we'll have like two of the guys do it. Like you two are doing this, you'll do this month and you'll do this month. And just is like a way to kind of like normalize all the work that goes into these things. Because sometimes like forced family fun, it's really easy to sort of dismiss that because you don't realize like they put so much effort into like planning. And so it's really easy to go like, oh, why'd you do this? And then when we started like passing it out, then everyone realized it's like, oh, this wasn't easy to do. Like I had to kind of be creative. So we're at the top of the hour. So I'm going to open it up. So if anyone wants to pop on their cameras, you know, we're just having fun here chatting. Um, Alexandra and Chinchin, who are both part of WiA and have been very active with our call to action, I wanted to open it up to you two. I almost wanted to have you guys just join us from the beginning because it feels very, very weird. Ooh, someone else from California. Hey there. I wanted to ask you guys as I look through the chat, you know, what are your thoughts on this discussion? Like any of this, like allyship, being the only, like anything you'd like to chime in that you were like secretly holding in as we were all talking. I know you guys have comments. I'm going to pick on Alexandra, then give Chin Chin a couple seconds to gather your thoughts. But what was popping in your head while we were talking?
Yeah, for me, I relate to all of the discussions in the allyship. I think it was really important. I think early on in my career, I always liked the exposure of going to the site for this because of that same reason. But again, it was the same thing for being a Latina and being the only one in the room and the only one that spoke Spanish. And most of the workers just speak Spanish and they just get surprised. They were like, oh man, she understands what we're saying. So yeah, so I related a lot with all of the discussion of what the career progressions and in the different stages, how they go to. Um, and I really enjoy listening to the growth through leadership as well. Just like being able to shadow people and eventually break your shell in order to become that leader in your firm now or in wherever you are to inspire other individuals like ourselves to do the same thing.
Yes, definitely. And you're in a really interesting situation because your firm is all women, right?
Yes. Where I am, we're all women, we're all moms. So it is, yes. It is a different story, yeah, compared to where when you are starting a job. It's again, you have a different focus, but I guess your career takes you in that direction. And I think it's always to find a supported place that supports who you want to be, where you want to go, and what path you want to take through your career.
Definitely. And I think that also just, you know, it's like I guess there's different ways to still be the only in your firm, but at least like, you know, you're not kind of like the only person who's leaving to take care of a child or like, you know, I imagine you all must clean up after meetings then, right? Like
Yes. Or set up before the meeting.
I know exactly.
Before,
Whatever
like,
it is.
it's so funny. It's like clients are coming and nobody's, yeah, I am one of those. I set up, yeah. And even at an early age, they call me mom without being a mom. All my friends did.
Oh my goodness. That's hilarious. Chin Chin, what were your thoughts on this? Like,
Yeah.
on just anything that we talked about?
Sure. Actually, I was thinking about two things, and it's funny that Alexandra and you brought up their firm is primarily women. So my firm, Salon Architecture, we have now 27 and 25 of us are women. So we're also in a very, but also I think the culture that our office brings, we have a lot of flexibility even before, I guess, COVID and a lot of people working from home, we already had that as part of our culture. So I guess part of the discussion in bringing more people and more opportunities is to provide these flexibility and other benefits that, would help, particularly women or mothers or other people that might have left for profession at a certain time to be to support people in general to do that. And then another item that I was thinking, and I see that Christina also mentioned that, so she had a question about as a quieter person and a recent grad, struggling with imposter syndrome. And I was already thinking about that too on a site being the only. Sometimes I question, is it because I'm a woman, or at the time when I was younger and just questioned my abilities to lead some, more technical topics with consultants. A lot of engineers are also males, are men, besides the contractors. And then something that helped me was kind of, it's not really detaching, but, I'm here because I know more about a certain subject, being the designer on the team than other people. So whatever it is that I have to contribute, no one knows that more than I do, I guess, because I drew it or I did something. So just kind of pumping myself up before that meeting, even though I don't know a lot about the mechanical systems or electrical systems, I know this portion of that. So I don't know if that's leading into that, but something that I was thinking about, not necessarily focusing on being the outlier, but what you can contribute.
Yeah, and actually, just before we hopped on, we were talking about imposter syndrome, and one of my favorite articles is there's a woman, Ruchika Tulshan and Jody, starts with a B. I can't remember her name. I'll see if I can find it. They ended up doing a podcast episode on Brene Brown's Dare to Lead, but they wrote a very, very popular Harvard Business Review article that said, "Stop telling women that they have imposter syndrome." And it was all about this concept that, like, the whole concept of imposter syndrome sort of like puts it on you, like you have some sort of like low self-esteem, psychological problem that you can't, like, you're constantly questioning it. And these two argue very firmly that no, this is the canary in the coal mine that's showing that, like, there is a lot of stuff around you, the firm, society, that is constantly making you prove and reprove that you do know your stuff. And that element is what you're reacting to. So, like, going to the thing about being quieter, I mean, that is a direct, like, connection to, really this extrovert bias, right? Like, what does a leader look like? And if you read Quiet by Susan Cain or see her TED Talk, like, she talks about that a lot, right? Like, there's sort of this definitive image of a leader, and it's usually a dude, and it's always someone who's very loud, very extroverted. And when you're not fitting into these, that's where the imposter syndrome comes in, because you're just like, oh no, there's this, like, I can't, can I shapeshift into this? Versus, like, what you're saying, Chin Chin, is like, I don't need to shapeshift. Like, I can just be quiet and still, like, know these drawings inside out. And I think that is a difference. So I would really, like, I was very, very interested in that article where I was just like, yeah, there really is no imposter syndrome. It's like my warning bells that I can't shapeshift into what you want me to be. And that's what I'm picking up on. And maybe that's a sign. But I don't know. What do you guys think? Do you guys think that, like, for other grads, like this question right here, especially being quieter and younger. So now you have elements of othering, right? Like, do you feel imposter syndrome is real? Am I too influenced by this article? And
I'm gonna jump in. I'm gonna have to reframe my thoughts on imposter syndrome, Janki. I'd love to see that article, because I definitely feel like I have it all the time. And Christina, I still have it. all the time. But I think what helped me was at one point realizing that I was also surrounded by people that still had questions, still had things to learn. They also didn't know. So just giving myself the uh, the key word of going, I don't know that, but I'm going to find out, and then following up and figuring it out, helped me kind of break out of my shell in architecture and in projects. That I didn't have to fake confidence when I didn't have it. And it actually increased the respect of those around me, and helped me really flip how I perceived even myself.
Yes, we talked about that in a couple of the sessions before. It's like nothing will actually like undercut you quicker than trying to like fake your way into, like a column layout. Like if you try to like, something like that, it's just like they'll know when you don't know. But I think being honest about like what you do know, what you can find out, I think those are very good advice. I have a question for you guys. Other people chime in if you want to also put your camera back on, you can. Advice for our students as they start to look at like, how do I gauge a firm? Like if I'm starting to like, put out resumes, put out internship applications, what should I look at? Like, what are my red flags, green flags? Like, what flags do you suggest that people have that might kind of show that there could be a better sense of belonging in a firm or equity?
I can go. I think that there's probably a lot of like very charted out like pros that like you should definitely look for this or you should definitely look for this. But for me, it's like the energy that I feel in the interview and like the confidence in the decision-making process that firm had around me, like those things were really important to me. And I know that a lot of firms operate a little bit differently when they hire. It's like they have a whole process, like maybe you have to go to 4 or 5 different interviews before you get an offer made. You might have to talk to several individuals. And I've definitely been on those types of interviews where it's almost like I showed up to one interview and they gave me a Revit quiz, like where I sat down at a computer and took a quiz on like whether I knew Revit. And I was applying for a job saying that I had like 10 years of BIM experience in BIM management. And so, it just didn't feel great. Like I've had people quiz me on like, well, what would you do in this Revit situation? And so like those interviews never felt great, but I've had interviews where I could just tell that the interviewer was so confident that I was who they wanted. They made me an offer quickly, and they made me feel really good. Like, we want to hear back from you. When are you going to be able to tell us? And that really, led to a successful job, knowing that my future employer had so much confidence in me from the get-go and that they were really like invested in what I was telling them. And it wasn't like they were trying to trip me up. So I think that you can vibes aren't everything, but I think some good interview vibes are definitely somewhere good to start. Like, and if you have those like red flags, like, hey, they gave me a Revit quiz, but like I'm really like overqualified for just like this work in general, then maybe that's a pass.
I think you're bringing up a very interesting point that a lot of, like, it's been documented that like a lot of, people of color and women face, which is like this prove it again bias. It's like if you've been working in the industry for 10 years, you should not need to like the question should really be about like your management style and like how you run a project. But the fact that like something is elementary as like, so that might be different if you're straight out of school. I could see where maybe they're like where, but I mean, when you interview for different positions, you have a general sense of like what you expect that person to do. And like you don't expect like a person who has like less than 2 years of experience to be able to like run a project that way like a PA would. So like I think your point is like making my spidey sense tingle that maybe that's what you were picking up on. This is like, why do you have to
Right.
prove it again? I've been doing this. Like,
Just
yeah,
red flag, I
red
guess.
flag. Other people, Cindy, and you came on. I was happy to see you join. Cindy's the current chair for LEA
Yeah, I'm the current
and
chair,
a
yeah.
structural engineer. So I threw
Yeah.
that column layout for you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm glad. I'm glad to hear that people are really thoughtful about, structural engineers and taking consideration what we do. But no, I mean, this is just an amazing conversation. I've been laughing over here, listening to everyone. Yeah, no, it's really hard, in my particular, being Colombian, everybody thinks we Colombians are the same. And, and I get that question, so where's the best food, Colombian food to eat? I was like, I don't know, I make it at home. I get that a lot. The same thing, I come from the manufacturing part that architects don't get to see. I used to work with Escobedo Group. We used to do I was in the Darío panelizing system. So basically, I was the only female on my team. I was the only Spanish speaker on my team. So, and we had the guys working right, the other side. So it was always challenge, and you have to set your grounds, and you always get that. I do believe in imposter syndrome because but I also know how to embrace my skill set and actually put my foot down, like this is what I know and this is what I have to offer, and I'm really straight with that. So this is what I know, and if I don't know, I will ask. That's one thing that I'm really I'm grateful to the company that I work for. I work for Ocam Design. We're a structural engineer firm, and I'm so grateful that I found them and they found me because they allow me to ask dumb questions, and it's okay, because they're building me out to become this, something different. So I love it. I love the opportunity that I get with my company, and but I mean, in general, it's just it is hard. It is hard. It is hard to get into and to build that confidence. It takes a long time. I've been in the industry for 10 years, so I hear you sometimes. Um, but you just have to embrace your skills. That's one thing that I always tell people. You have to embrace your skill. What do you know? Each one of us has something to bring to the table, So how do we bring it? That's another story, but we all have to. And that's how kind of overcome that imposter syndrome. That's how I always overcome. Okay, so this is what I know. And if I don't know, I ask, it's like, how do you do this? Like, and I love because also my engineer peers, they're like so grateful because they also take in consideration my input regarding humanity, and I just love that they allow me to be human, like think about like whenever we're setting up drawings, we're setting up a steel or we think about okay, so how do the workers are going to work there in the field, how they're going to install these, how many guys are going to need to lift this beam, and they allow me to be human and bring that humanity to our project. So that's
I mean, well, that's constructability though. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
like I mean, there is like a human element, but you're also looking at like, that's a very specific skill set of the logistics. Like this looks great on a drawing set. And then like once it's on a field, is this possible? Are you gonna get a bunch of RFIs? Is it gonna shut
Yes.
down the field because no one can understand what what we
Yeah,
put
never what
together?
they're doing. Yeah. So that that I'm just so grateful to work with Allcam that they allow me to explore everything and they say yes to everything that I want to do, which is lovely to be in a company like that. We are full remote, so it gives me a lot of flexibility, and that's one thing that I get to tell people. We're in a stage. After COVID, we all learned that there's flexibility and because for people that listen right now, they're in college still, they're recent graduates, there's a company for you and that is going to align to your culture. There is out there because when I graduated 10 years ago, the way to find a job to be successful was to go an 8 to 5 Monday through Friday, to have a 401k, have all that stuff. But now, COVID showed me that I need more than that. I need my work and life balance. I need to be able to take off when I have to go to pick up my kids, when one of my dogs gets sick and I don't have to be checking in with someone, so
that's the company that I choose, and that aligns to my belief and my culture. You see, so I mean, there is a company for each one of us nowadays, because unfortunately, we have to lose a lot of people during COVID, but it also help us to, like, evolve and to progress to something different. And now, a lot of you guys work remote, like me. A lot of you guys work a hybrid. Oh, some of you guys work completely full in the office, but there is so much for everyone out there now. So
Definitely.
that's all I
So
have
look
to
at
say.
the AIA job board. There's definitely opportunities.
There
So
you go.
Selma, you joined us a year ago. As you were beginning to do your search, like now like retrospect, because that's kind of what our thing is, like the 2020 hindsight. What would you say? I don't want you to out any of the firms you looked at, but like what were some of like your green flags, I guess, that you were like, I hope I see this, and that kind of, because there's only so much you could find in an interview, right? Like, you don't really know. So for you, what were some of the green flags that you've seen throughout your career?
I would definitely say like step one was how they find you. Sometimes they just cold email you on LinkedIn or something, like, hey, we found you, blah, 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 but it just seems like a copy paste type of email,
Ooh.
like that's red flag right there. And I'm like, you want to respond and be nice, but at the same time acknowledge. Um, but I would say in an interview, a green flag for me is always like how the conversation takes place and how it goes on tangents. If it just feels like we're talking as friends, then that's, a very good green flag, is like, hey, you know, I can see myself talking to these people about a Netflix series or something, not just details. And, to have those kind of thoughtful conversations about what you expect and what you want out of a company at the same time. Because it's not only a one-sided conversation, like they want you as just as bad as you want them. It's a relationship. I mean, it's a business. Like everything is symbiotic. And I would say that was a green flag, those conversations and how they took shape, and how quickly, going back to Lindsay's point, how quickly they were like, hey, you know what, like, we know you have other offers on the table. When does that one expire or something? Like, we're going to send you something literally in 2 hours if we have to. And, not so much as a desperation, but, just knowing that they saw the talent in me, which with going back to the imposter syndrome, I did not believe. I was like, why do they want me? But at the same time, I'm like, you know what? I bring a lot to the table, as do all of us. Like, yeah, like maybe I might not be an expert at XYZ, but I'm willing to learn, and I'm willing to ask for help when I need it. And just having them understand, like, hey, like whatever you want me to do, I will take a stab at it. And, you know, if I sink or swim, I'm just gonna ask for help along the way. And just knowing that it's not a super rigid environment in which I could not see myself for a very long time, and I think this is a question that I asked. I was like, what motivates you to be here at the office every single day? Like, what has kept you here? And that kind of stumbled them. They were like, that's a good question. And I was like, no, yeah, honestly, like, why are you still here X amount of years later? And they were like, you know what? Like, it's about the culture, it's about the people that we work with, it's about whatever, but just hearing their side of things, because I mean, they're here for a reason. And, if they found it to be a good environment to grow and develop, then maybe so will I. So,
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think that kind of ties right back to Heather's comment about agency, and like every day you go back, every day you show up, you're making a choice to be there, right? So it's like, why are these people being there for this long. We are almost out of time, and I wanted to remind everyone, Alexandra is so good about this. We have one more session tomorrow, which is our last virtual session, which is actually a really good one. I'm really excited about it. It's called Pathways Beyond Traditional Practice. So we have 5 speakers. It's our biggest group, and they're all people who officially graduated with an architecture degree and now no longer work in-house as an architect. So we have one of my friends who's at Tesla, another one at Icon, one who works at GlueMac, the other one who, Gerardo, who is part of the brand experience at Gensler. So he's doing something completely different than architecture. And then I have a structural engineer who has her Archi-E degree along with her architecture degree, who never practiced. So we're going to talk about like what their origin stories were. So if you guys are able to join us tomorrow, we'd love to see you. And then for everybody, we have an in-person event on the 10th at McKinney York here in Austin. So this is a chance to practice your networking skills, meet people face to face, connect with other people. Everyone, all of our speakers, as well as members of WiA will be there. So I hope you're able to join us. I'm going to close this out, but this was such a fun discussion. I really want to thank our speakers, Heather, Lindsay, Selma. Thank you for just opening up. You brought in such vulnerability and openness and also positivity to a topic that can sometimes like spiral down, but I felt like it was so important for us to talk about. I really, really appreciate it and found everything you said so insightful and fun. And then for everyone else who showed up and then chimed in, I feel like this, like I said, this could have been like a 50-person panel, because I feel like talking about being the only is something that affects so many people, and expressing those stories are so important. And so that's part of the reason why we like to do it as part of the Hindsight series, because it's something no one ever talks about, but it's always there. So with that, I want to thank you guys. I hope to see some of you guys tomorrow. Remember, this is a free event. So if you have other friends or other architecture students, feel free to pass the registration, because people can sign up anytime. It's just really easy. So with that, I'm going to call it a night, and I hope you guys have a really good one, and I will see some of you guys tomorrow. Thank you, ladies, so much for participating. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Janki.
Thanks, guys.